Alright, so now that we've built out a very basic server using Node.js and Express for our full stack application, the next thing that we're going to do is see how to persist our data in a database. Now, since both our client and server side are written in JavaScript, it makes sense to persist our data in a database that plays very nicely with JavaScript and has a similar format to the kind of data that we want to store. And for that, we don't need to look any further than MongoDB. Now, MongoDB is what's called a non-relational database. And basically what this means is that we can just sort of push JavaScript data into it without worrying too much about how that data is formatted. Now, in the case of MongoDB, what we can do is simply hand our database any kind of JSON that we want, and it will just store that for us and allow us to retrieve them later whenever we need them. Alright, now this is in pretty stark contrast to some of the traditional relational databases, such as SQL-based databases like MySQL, where the structure of the data and the fields that it contains have to generally be defined in advance and adhered to whenever we add new data. Alright, so working with relational databases also generally requires some knowledge of SQL, of course, and so by using this, we would sort of fall short of our ideal of being able to write our full stack application using only JavaScript. So anyway, that's MongoDB, and that's why we're going to be using it here. So let's get started and see how to add this to our app. Alright, so now that we know what MongoDB is, and what we're going to be using it for, let's get it up and running on your computer. Now, if you're using a Mac like I am in this video, I highly recommend that you install MongoDB using Homebrew. Or if you're using some other operating systems such as Windows, I'm afraid that I really can't help you too much with that. But I'm going to direct you to MongoDB's installation instructions for MongoDB Community Edition. And in order to find these, all you have to do is search for MongoDB Community Edition installation tutorials, and you should be able to find this page, which contains a pretty extensive listing of all the different operating systems that you might need to install MongoDB on. So, like I said, the way that I'm going to be installing this on Mac is using something called Homebrew, which is a really nice package manager for the Mac operating system, right? It is to Mac what, let's say, NPM is to Node.js projects. It just makes it really easy to install different things that you can use. So, I've already got Homebrew installed on my computer, but if you don't, you're going to want to go to Homebrew's website, which is http://www.brew.sh.com currently, and install it basically just by copying this script here, and running that in your terminal. You're just going to paste that in your terminal, and run it, and wait until it finishes. And once you've finished that, what you should be able to do is go back to your terminal and type something like brew version, and hit enter. Basically that will just tell you what version of Homebrew you have. Mine's currently 3.5.2, yours might be something higher than that. But all of this stuff should be pretty much the same. And, once you have Homebrew installed, you're going to want to install MongoDB by running the command brew install. And then you're going to say MongoDB Community at 5.0, now this, at 5.0, thing, basically. That's just making sure that we're at the same version at the point that you're watching this. There might be a later version, but you know, I would still recommend installing this just so everything's going to be the same for you. So let's hit enter. And this should install the MongoDB community server on our computer. And, after that, all we have to do is create the default database directory, where our MongoDB files are going to live. Now to do this, all we have to do is create a new folder inside our My Blog backend. And, I'm just going to call this folder something like data. And in fact, we can even call it like MongoDB data if we want something like that, and this is going to be the folder that will have MongoDB store our data in. So, now that we've done that, what we should be able to do is start the Mongo daemon, which basically the Mongo daemon is just a process that runs in the background, and allows us to interact with our database via a shell. For example, we'll see how to do that in a minute. And, We should be able to start the Mongo daemon by saying MongoD, and then we're going to say db path, and we're going to point it at that folder we just created. So, we'll say MongoDB and hit enter, and that should start the Mongo daemon running in the background. Now, I already have it running currently on my computer, so I'm not going to run this command, but you'll probably want to leave that running in your terminal, and just open up a new terminal alongside that. Okay, so once MongoDB is running, you should be able to connect to it via the Mongo shell by typing Mongo, and hitting enter. And this again will bring up what's called the Mongo shell, which is basically just a little terminal that you can use to type in MongoDB commands. So, the first thing that we're going to do here is create a new database called ReactBlogDB. And the way that we can do that is simply by typing use, and then saying the database name, in our case ReactBlogDB, and hitting enter. And we're now in our database. So, what's next? Well, since we're planning on replacing this fake database JavaScript array thing that we had in our server.js file with MongoDB, what we're going to do is insert this data into our database so that we can persist it better. So, what this is going to look like is in our Mongo shell we're going to say db.articles.insertMany, and this is basically just a function that we call with all of the different documents that we want to insert. Now, before we do this, let's just go through a little bit of MongoDB terminology. This articles thing that you see here after DB is what's referred to as a collection. In MongoDB, each database is composed of a few collections, or many collections, depending on how big your database is. And these collections contain any number of JSON objects, and we call these objects documents. So, what we're going to insert here is a series of documents. And, basically all we need to do for that is copy what we had here for our articles info. So, I'm just going to select all of this and copy it. And then we'll go down here and paste it, and I'm just going to hit paste. And then we just need to close off the parentheses, and hit enter. And, what you should see as output is this object that says, acknowledge true, which means that everything went well. And, we also have this inserted IDs thing, which is basically all of the randomly generated IDs that MongoDB has assigned to those things that we just inserted. So, if you want to see all of the documents in our database now, what you should be able to do is just say db.articles.find with an empty object in between those parentheses there and hit enter. And, sure enough, you'll see all of that data printed out. Now, if you want to see this printed out in a nicer way, you can always add .pretty on the end of that. And, that will print that out in a nicely formatted way for us. Okay, so those are two of the basic commands that you'll be using in the MongoDB shell. One more thing that I want to point out is if you want to find a single object in MongoDB, right? If you want to filter by something, what you can do is for this find function, you're just going to specify some sort of property that you want to look for, and the value that it should contain. So let's say that we want to find the article with the name, Learn React. Well, all we need to do for that is add name Learn React to this object. This is called the query object in MongoDB. And if we hit enter, we'll see that that gives us the article that matches that criteria. Okay. And if there are several articles that match that criteria, it will just return all of them. So, we'll say upvotes 0, for example, if we want to get all of the articles that have 0 upvotes, and we'll see that that returns several articles. Okay, so at this point our database is set up to work with our backend. So, the next thing that we're going to see how to do is actually start incorporating MongoDB into our Express server, and making queries to it from our endpoints. One last thing is that in order to exit out of your Mongo shell, all you need to do is press Ctrl+C and that will bring you back to your terminal. Alright, so now that we've got MongoDB up and running on our machine as well as some basic data we can use for development, let's see how we can incorporate this into our Express server. Now, the first thing that we're going to want to do, of course, is install the MongoDB driver package into our project. And we can do that by just saying npm install mongodb, and hitting enter, alright. So that's the name of the npm package here. And this package is basically just going to allow us to do the same thing inside our Node.js code as we did in the Mongo shell, right? So it will allow us to connect to a database and make queries to that database. So since we're going to be connecting to the database and using that data now, what we can do is actually remove this articles info array. And eventually we're going to need to replace a lot of the logic inside these endpoints that we defined, since instead of just modifying JavaScript objects in memory, we're actually going to be making queries to the Mongo database. So, first though, what we're going to do is create a new endpoint that will allow our client side to actually load the information for a given article, right? So our article page, as you'll see later on, is going to need to know how many upvotes an article has, as well as what comments that article has so that it can display those. And in order to make that happen, we're going to need to create a new endpoint here just for that purpose. So here's what the endpoint is going to look like. We're going to say app-get, and the path here is going to be //API/articles/name, alright, and this name is a URL parameter here. And then we're going to add our callback function, and inside this callback function, basically all we're going to need to do is get the current value of this name URL parameter, and use that to query MongoDB and get the information for that article. Okay, so first things first, let's just get the value of the URL parameter by saying const name equals request.params. And now what we're going to need to do is connect to MongoDB and make a query to it. So in order to do this, first of all, we're going to need to import something from the MongoDB package that we just installed. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say import Mongo client from MongoDB, and this Mongo client thing is what we can use to actually connect to the database. So down here, what we're going to do is say, const client equals new Mongo client. And then we need to pass in the URL of our Mongo database. Now yours should be the same as mine here because we're just connecting to our local MongoDB instance that we have running. So that's going to be mongod //. And then we're going to say 127.0.0.1, right? So that's localhost, but we do need to use the actual IP address in order for this to work. And then we're going to specify the port, which is going to be 27017. Alright, and that's pretty much it. The next thing that we're going to need to do is actually have this client connect. And to do that, we just need to say await client.connect. Alright, so this is asynchronous, which is why we need the await keyword here. And that means that we need the async keyword added to this callback function as well. And don't worry too much if you're not familiar with async and await. Just know that they're a nice way to deal with asynchronous code in JavaScript. Okay, so at this point we have a connection created to our Mongo database. So we're going to need to get the specific database that we created earlier. And to do that, we just need to say, const db equals client.db. And then we need to specify the name of our database, right? Remember that we said, React BlogDB, and we set that as the name of our database. So this will give us a reference to our database. This is very similar to what we did in the shell when we said use React BlogDB, except this is obviously the Node.js version of doing that instead of in the shell. And now that we have a reference to that database, we can finally make our query to load the article by its name. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say, const article equals await db.collection, articles. And then we're going to say, .find one. And the criteria we're going to be searching for here is the name property of that article should be equal to the name URL parameter. Alright, so a few things I want to point out about this line here that we just typed out. The first thing is that instead of saying db.articles as we did in the shell, we said db.collection articles. And that's just a little difference between how things work in the shell versus how things are done in Node.js, right? So in Node.js, you have to say db.collection, and actually pass the collection name as a string, instead of being able to just say db. And then the collection name. And the second thing I wanted to point out is, that we use this find one function, which basically allows us to find a single document inside a MongoDB collection. Alright, so we generally use this when we're searching for a document by a unique ID, and we know that at most we're going to get one result back, right? When we know that we're not going to get several results back, for example, if we were searching for all of the articles with 0 upvotes, let's say. Okay, so now that we have the article, let's just test this out by sending it back to the client. And to do that, we just need to say response.send, and we're going to send that article back. Now so far, we've mainly been sending back strings from our Node server, but when we're sending back JSON data as we are in this case, what we're going to want to do instead is use the response.json function, which basically just makes sure that the correct headers are set on that response. And that should really be all we need. So let's make sure our server is running. And if you don't have that running, you can do so by running npm run dev and hitting enter. And then let's head over to Postman and send a request. It's going to be a GET request sent to API/articles/ and then we're going to fill in the ID of one of the articles. And if we click send, we should see that sure enough, we get the data for that article back from the server. Alright, and you can try this out if you want to do Learn Node for example, and click send, you'll see that that will give us back the data for Learn Node. And if we want to look up our MongoDB article, I believe the name for that is just MongoDB. So we'll click send, and sure enough, we'll see the data for that article comes back as well. So one last thing that we'll want to do here now is, in case this article doesn't exist, just like we did in our other endpoints down here, we're going to want to just send back some kind of alternative response. So what we'll do is say, after we get the article, that is, if article then, and only then will we want to try and send that article back to the client. Otherwise, what we're going to want to do is send back some sort of status code. Now, in this case, the 404 status code would be appropriate since we didn't find the article with that corresponding name. So what we can do to send back just a 404 status code is, we can say response.sendStatus 404, okay. And if you wanted to send back an extra message or something like that, you could just say response.status 404, and then say .send, with a message like article not found. But generally sending back a 404 status code alone is going to be enough. And we can actually test this out if we go back to Postman and try and load an article with an ID that doesn't exist. And if we click send now, what we'll see is that sure enough we get back a 404 status code that tells us not found. Alright, so that's all we need to do to create this endpoint that will allow our front end eventually to load info for a specific article. And the next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to rewrite our upvote endpoint to use MongoDB as well. Alright, so now that we've created this endpoint for loading article info from MongoDB, the next thing that we're going to need to do is go through and modify our upvoting endpoint and our comments endpoint to use MongoDB instead of that fake in-memory database which they're currently referencing that no longer exists, right? So this is actually going to be pretty straightforward. All we're really going to need to do is replace this line where we say articles info.find with an actual query to MongoDB. Now, the setup code here, right? The code for connecting to MongoDB is going to be pretty much the same as what we saw up here in our getArticle endpoint. So just to go through that again, what we're going to need to do is use Mongo client to connect to MongoDB. And that's going to look like this. We'll say, const client equals new Mongo client, and then we'll have the URL, which again is going to be MongoDB://1270001. And then it's going to be port 27017, which is the default port for MongoDB in case you didn't get that before. And then of course, we need to connect by calling awaitClient.connect. And once we've established that connection we can make a query. All we're going to need to do here is update this article with the name from the URL parameters by incrementing its upvote count by 1. Now this is going to look a little bit different from what we did up here. When we found an article, because in order to update an article in MongoDB we need to use another function. So what this is going to look like, we're going to say, const db, and get a reference to the database that we're working with here. So we'll say equals client.db react blog db. And then underneath that, we're going to make our query by saying await db.collection. And it's of course going to be our articles collection here. And then we're going to say .update1. And the way that this function works is the first argument is the same kind of query object that we saw when we used find1, right? We're going to say that we want to update an article whose name property is equal to this name, URL parameter. The second argument is where things get a little bit different. The second argument is going to contain the changes that we want to make to the matching article here. So what this is going to look like, it's going to be another object. And what we're going to do here is say $inc, and the value for this is going to be yet another object. I'll explain all of this syntax in just a second here. So don't worry about it too much right now. And what we're going to do is say upvotes1. Alright. So what's going on here? Well, basically what we're telling MongoDB here is that we want to update an article whose name property is equal to the URL parameter. Alright. We already knew that. And this second argument, this object, is how MongoDB wants us to specify changes, right? And in this case, what we're doing is we're telling MongoDB that we want to increment the upvotes field by 1. So the order here might seem a little bit strange, but this is just how MongoDB does things, right? This $inc thing is just one of many different MongoDB operators. For example, there's another one. If you just wanted to set a property on a document to a certain value, you would say $set. And you know, if you wanted to say set upvotes to 100, you could say set upvotes to 100. Okay. So the point here is that when working with MongoDB and Node.js you just need to use these $operator things in order to tell MongoDB exactly what type of change you want to make. So anyway, once we've incremented the number of upvotes by 1 on the matching article, what we're going to want to do is actually load the article to figure out how many upvotes it now has and be able to send that information back to the client. So what this is going to look like is we're just going to say const article equals await db.collection articles, just like what we had before, .find1. And we're going to find the article whose name matches the name URL parameter. And you may notice that this line is exactly the same as what we did up here in our getArticle endpoint. Okay. So now that we've done that, we should be able to send back the article's upvotes to the client side and everything down here should still work. So let's give this thing a try. First of all, we're going to want to make sure our app is running. And if you open up your terminal, what you're going to see is that we actually have an error. And that's just because we use the await keyword without adding async to the surrounding function. Alright, so we used await here. We need to add async to our callback function, and now we should see that our server is successfully running. Alright. So if we go back to Postman now, we should be able to send a put request to. Here let's try put API articles, and let's try upvoting the learn React article, and then we're going to say /upvotes. And if we click send now, it looks like we have an error, and that's just because this should be upvote instead of upvotes. So let's try that again. And sure enough, we'll see that it says the learn React article now has 2 upvotes. Alright. Now the reason that this is 2 is just because I tested this out beforehand to make sure it worked, but you may see 1 there. And if we click send again, we'll see that that gives us 3 upvotes. So anyway, we've now converted our upvote endpoint over to use MongoDB. The last thing that we're going to want to do is convert our comments endpoint to use MongoDB as well. Alright, so now that we've converted our upvote endpoint over to use MongoDB, the last endpoint that we have to convert is our comments endpoint, so let's head back to our IDE and do that. Alright, we're going to scroll down now to our post API /articles/name/comments endpoint, and essentially, what we're going to need to do inside of here is the same thing that we did in our upvote endpoint. We're just going to need to change this part where we're saying articlesinfo.find, and we're going to need to change article.comments.push to an actual MongoDB query. And actually, as a matter of fact, I'm realizing now that we forgot to remove this article.upvotes plus equals one thing from above in our upvote endpoint. And that's actually why we were seeing one extra upvote on our articles. I thought it was just because I tested it beforehand, but apparently not. So anyway, let's head back down to our comments endpoint, and what we're going to do is remove this articles.findThing and article.comments.push. And we're going to replace those with the logic for connecting to MongoDB and adding an extra comment onto an article. So first things first, let's connect to MongoDB. And actually, what we can do is just copy and paste the code directly from another endpoint. So we'll just copy and paste this stuff here. And we'll paste it in our comments endpoint. And I'm not a big fan of copying and pasting code generally. So what I'll do, once we've finished this, is actually show you a way that you can do this without having to copy and paste your code. Alright, I'll show you a more reusable way of connecting to MongoDB. So now that we've done that, the next thing that we're going to do is make a query to our database that will add a new comment with posted by and text onto this article with the name property from the URL parameters. And that's going to look like this. We're just going to say, await db.collection. Alright, we're working with our articles collection. And then we're going to say .update1, just like we did up in our upvotes endpoint. And we're going to want to update the article whose name matches the name URL parameter. And for the updates object, instead of saying $inc, which stands for $increment, like we did in the upvotes section, we're going to say $push. And after that, we're going to say comments, and then we'll specify our new comment by saying, posted by and text. So what's happening here is we're telling MongoDB that we want to push onto the comments property this new object that we're defining right here. Alright, so this is how we tell MongoDB that we want to add a new item to an array in its sort of query object language. Alright, so now that we've done that, just like we did up above in our upvotes endpoint, we're going to want to load the updated article. And to do that, we can just say const article equals, and then we're going to say db.collection, articles again, .find one whose name is equal to name. And that's it. Oh here, we do need to add the await keyword here. And that also means we need to add the async keyword to the callback. I almost forgot that there. And that should be all we need to do for this endpoint. So let's open up our terminal. Make sure everything's running correctly. And sure enough, it looks like our server is running on port 8000. So let's go back now to Postman. And what we should be able to do is send a request. It's going to be a post request that is to API/articles/learnreact/comments. And we're going to want a new comment in here. So let's change this comment so that it says something like, awesome article. And let's try sending this thing. So if we click send, what we should see is this array containing the new comment that we just added. And if we add another comment as well, like this, and click send, we should see that both of those are there. And just to demonstrate now that we've converted everything over to MongoDB, what I want you to do is go back to your code and actually stop your server. Alright, this normally would have wiped out all of the data that we had accumulated in the memory. And we're going to run our app again. And what you'll see is if you send another comment, if you submit a new comment to this endpoint. Let's try doing someone else. We'll say posted by John. And we'll say, are there any other comments? And if we click send, what we're going to see is that sure enough, there are other comments. And in addition to this one that we just submitted, the old comments that we added are there as well. So in other words, our application's data was successfully persisted by MongoDB, which is again, one major advantage of working with databases in the first place. So now that we've converted the comments endpoint over to use MongoDB, the last thing that I want to show you here is how to make this code a little bit more reusable for connecting to MongoDB. All you really need to do, and you can do this in a separate file if you want to try and keep this server.js file small. What we're going to do is say new file. We'll call this file db.js. And what we're going to do here is say, let db, and we're not going to assign any value to it yet. And then what we're going to do is create a new function, which we'll call something like connect_to_db. And this function is going to take a callback. You'll see what that's used for in a minute. And what we're going to do inside this function is just copy and paste all of the database connection code that we've been duplicating in all of our endpoints. So we'll just copy this here, all the way down to client.db. And we'll paste that inside the function, and this function is going to need to be async, of course, since we're using a wait inside of it. And then what we're going to do is, instead of defining db as a new thing here, we're just going to say set db equal to client.db. And then we're going to export that so that it can be imported in our server file. You'll see what this looks like in just a second, but we'll say export, and then we'll export both our db and our connect_to_db function. Cool, so now that we have both of those things defined, and by the way, we need to call cb after all of this is done. We'll just say cb like so. It doesn't need to take any arguments. And then back in our server, what we can do is import those things from our database file. And by the way, we're going to need to move this Mongo client import into db.js as well. We'll just put that up at the top here. And now back in our server, we'll say import, and we're going to import db, and connect to db from our db.js file. We're going to need to say db.js. And you do need to include the JS thing here since we added type module to our package.json. Alright, just something to be aware of. And now that we have these things, we can just go through and remove all of the connection code. So we can remove these 3 lines here from our getArticle endpoint. We can remove those same 3 lines from our upvote endpoint, and we can delete those same 3 lines from our comments endpoint by deleting those there. And now, keep in mind that this db is just the thing that we're importing from db.js. So what this means is that we just need to call connect_to_db in order to make sure that that db is actually connected. And the way that we're going to do that is say connect_to_db like so. And inside this callback is where we're going to put our app listen. So in other words, our server won't even start up until we've successfully connected to the database. Alright, and we might even want to put in a console.log statement saying successfully, here we go, successfully connected to database, just to make sure everything goes well there. And now let's try running our code. Sure enough, it looks like we have successfully connected to database and server is listening on port 8000. So let's try sending a request to all of our endpoints just to make sure we did everything correctly. If we go back to Postman, let's first of all, try loading an article. We're going to send a GET request to API/articles/learnReact, and hit send. Sure enough, it looks like everything is there. So let's try upvoting this article by sending a put request to learnReact/upvote and click send. Sure enough, we'll see that it now has 3 upvotes. And lastly, let's try adding a comment by sending a post request with a request body here. We'll just say text, hello. And we're going to send that to learnReact/comments. So if we click send, sure enough, we see that that one works as well. So we've successfully converted our entire Node.js server over to use MongoDB, instead of just an in-memory array. So now we've completed our backend, and we can finally come to the point that many of you have been waiting for, which is when we bring our frontend and backend together into a full-stack application.